So, ladies and gentlemen, with a little bit of a delay, our apologies. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. My name is Gottfried Hagen, and I'm the director of this Center for Armenian Studies. And our guest today is Professor Sebouh Aslanian, who's the Richard Hovhannisyan Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History at the University of California, Los Angeles, also the director of the Armenian Studies program there. Sebouh obtained his PhD from Columbia University with distinction. He's been a Manoogian postdoc here at the University of Michigan, so we lay some claim to your fame.
If I have any, yes.
He's the author of an award-winning book, From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from New Julfa. So Sebouh's topic is very much global Armenians, if I can say that so flippantly, especially in the early modern era. And this book, based on a treasure trove of letters intercepted with a ship by the British Navy in 1748, shows a global network of merchants operating across the globe. And Sebouh shows us how these Armenians were the only Eurasian community that was able to operate simultaneously and successfully in all the major empires in the early modern world, both land-based Asian empires and the emerging seaborne empires, operating out of New Julfa, not sort of your sort of primary choice, first choice probably for a global trade network as a basis, and without the backing of a major imperial power themselves. So in the context also, however, he has developed a major methodological argument also for a global, what he calls a global microhistory, that looks at global contexts, but remains attuned to the individual source documents, close reading, and agency of individuals in the process. In recent years, he has been working on two projects side by side, another book sort of following up on the Santa Catarina cache of letters. But the other one just came out, eagerly awaited by many, also building on this notion of Armenian networks across the globe, early modernity and mobility, port cities and printers across the Armenian diaspora from Yale University Press. And as you can see, today's talk is closely related and building on that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the lectern over. Please join me in welcoming Sebouh Aslanian.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gottfried, for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank a whole host of people for making my talk here possible. Obviously, I'll start with all of them are friends. Catherine Babayan, Gottfried foremost. Vikan was very helpful with setting things up. My old friend Ron and everybody else here. It's always a pleasure to be back. Michael as well. Piper. Always a pleasure to be back in Michigan. I got my break in many ways here as a postdoc about 14, 15 years ago. So it's something that has left a very good impression on me. And I'm ever so grateful for that, even though technically I'm your competition now because I have a chair at UCLA. But I'm always a fair person. I recognize and admit and praise talent when I see it. So keep up the great work. With that in place, let me begin my talk today. My talk is essentially a book talk. I hope to be speaking about 45, 50 minutes or so. But given how things got off on the wrong foot today in terms of being delayed, I have a feeling I may have to be extra judicious in making sure that I stay on track with the time. So let me just read a few comments about the general scope of my book, and then I'll get into more details. So in his L'Origine de l'Imprimerie de Paris, published in Paris in 1694, André Chevillier, a librarian at the Sorbonne, recalls how an Orientalist colleague told him that, quote, an Armenian had shown him in Paris a book he had brought from Persia, which he claimed which he claimed those of his nation had printed in their language, unquote. The author's reluctance to believe that Armenians in 17th century Iran could have published a book in their own language is a telltale reflection of a popular perception in early modern Europe regarding the craft of printing. Scholars from Chevillier in the 17th century down to Lucien Febvre and Henri-Jean Martin of the 20th century, as well as more recently Elizabeth Eisenstein and Niall Green, a colleague and friend at UCLA, have at one point or another claimed or implied that the printing revolution initiated by Gutenberg unfolded on a, quote, European or settler European stage. This is a passage from my friend Niall that has been redacted or changed significantly since we had a discussion many, many years ago. Chevillier once again reinforces the exclusively European nature of the printing revolution. And I quote here from this interesting little obscure book of his. And he says, it is true that the printing press has left the bounds of Europe and has made itself visible in some cities of Asia and America. However, the people who have hosted it have not been other than Christian Europeans who live in those parts of the world and who have carried there the tools of printing through which they have placed in the hands of idolaters books of the Christian religion in the languages of those lands, and unquote. In the same passage where Chevillier expresses doubts about the possibility that an Armenian book could have indeed been printed in Iran at such an early time, he notes how the Carmelite missionaries had tried to import a printing press into Isfahan in the early years of the 17th century, but had failed to publish any books there due to the dry climate of the country. That indeed 3 separate Armenian-operated presses flourished in the Isfahani suburb of New Julfa from 1636 to 1692, followed during the next century by several Armenian-operated presses in the wide world of the Indian Ocean, as well as in Echmiadzin in today's Armenia, would have surely struck our Frenchmen as quite preposterous. So my book, Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800, provides a missing counterpoint to a largely Eurocentric retelling or retellings of book history shaped by the unexamined assumptions passed down from early writers like Chevillier to 20th century giants in the field of Histoire du Livre, the history of the book, relying on the methodological insights of the Annales school, but globalizing its European or national unit of analysis. My book examines the rise of Armenian printing centers beginning in 1512 in Venice and ending in Astrakhan, Madras, and Calcutta in 1794 to 96, across the mostly seascapes of the early modern Armenian diaspora. See if I can. In all, Armenian-run printing establishments operated across 21 separate locations during the Gutenberg era of printing, the overwhelming majority of which were in port city locations where Armenian long-distance merchants specializing in luxury commodities had set up tiny but affluent diasporic notes. And I refer to these merchants throughout my book as port Armenians, a calque on the Sephardic Jewish reference to port Jews versus court Jews. The Armenian case, I think, in some ways is a more fitting case of the geographic aspect of the port Armenian being significant in bringing out what's peculiar about these Armenians in port cities. They're both Western Armenian and Eastern Armenian. I'll talk about that in a second. So, yet the story of Armenian print culture told in this book, my book, does not focus solely on printing establishments. My aim is not to write yet another linear narrative of the saga of Armenian printing presses, concentrating on the history of the printing establishments and their operators as ends in themselves. Rather, I have sought to use an histoire du livre exploration of Armenian print culture and production, and the production of the printed Armenian codex to tell a much larger and more interesting story. I have utilized print culture as a lens through which to explore the making of the early modern Armenian diaspora, following the forced mobility and deportations that drove Armenians from their ancestral lands across the oceans, seas, and port cities of the burgeoning economy of archaic globalization, to use a famous term coined by the late, I knew I was going to forget his name, the late Mughal historian, among others, and a world historian, English, Christopher Bailey. So, archaic globalization. The story of the Armenian printing revolution told in my book was no doubt shaped by the port city structure of the early modern diaspora that came to be fashioned by its trans-regional networks of circulation and mobility. Both manuscripts and books circumnavigated this diaspora, as did merchants, priests, and often enough, printers with their own printing instruments. Sometimes the instruments traveled alone. My account of Armenian book history was in part inspired by reflections on books by the Trinidadian novelist and writer V.S. Naipaul, a writer whose ideological spectrum, let's say, is not one that is in agreement with most of my subject positions, but nonetheless, someone I respect highly because his use of English is really exceptional. He was an exceptionally gifted novelist. Obviously, he had issues that most of us today would find objectionable, but nonetheless, as I said, I respect talent when I see it. So, choosing to place the stress on what he called the, quote, mundane side of things, Naipaul noted how, quote, writing is a private act, but the published book, when it starts to live, speaks of the cooperation of oh, sorry. I'm going to go to the second slide. No, before this. Okay. That's it. I think it's just the wrong. Huh? Is it? Yeah. I thought I was controlling it. No. It's a placebo. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So let's put this slide right here. So you can see a play on words involving spine, the spine of the book, and so on. So he says, and I quote here, writing is a private act, but the published book, when it starts to live, speaks of the cooperation of a particular kind of society. Naipaul framed the act of book production in a wonderfully effective and evocative way. And I quote it once again. He says, but books are not created just in the mind. Books are physical objects. To write them, you need a certain kind of sensibility. You need a language. You need a certain gift of a language. And you need to possess a particularly literary form. To get your name on the spine of the created physical object, you need a vast apparatus outside yourself. You need publishers, editors, designers, printers, booksellers, critics, newspapers, and magazines, and of course, buyers and readers, unquote. So what I like about this meditation is its hard-nosed emphasis on the materiality of the book, on the simple fact that to materialize before readers, books need, quote, a vast apparatus of printers, publishers, binders, book manufacturers, distributors, and so on. In early Modernity and Mobility, I have tried to apply this kind of Napoleon sensibility to my retelling of the story of the Armenian printed codex. So with that in place, I will now navigate on automatic pilot and give you a general idea of the contents of this book, given the amount of time I have. And for some reason, I don't have my phone with me. Okay. So, I'll just say a couple of very quick things about the methodology of the book itself, which has to do with the notion of Frenchness versus what I call Armenianness in the history of the book. This is probably one of the most objectionable parts of my scholarship. Some people may claim, well, I essentialize too much on the notion of Frenchness, and particularly on the notion of Armenianness. So let me quickly summarize here what I mean by these terms. Frenchness is a term that was coined by my favorite annal historian of American origin, Robert Darnton, someone who's influenced me beyond anything I can put into words. Really, really important scholar and historian, still alive, I think, who basically coined the term Frenchness. It's an essentialism about French culture that he was able to arrive at after years and decades of studying the French. And Roger Chartier, who was a member of the Annales school, one of the last kind of members, he wrote a famous gave a famous keynote address at the American Book History Association, which was called Frenchness in the History of the Book, or What is Frenchness in the History of the Book, in which he basically argued that Frenchness is a synonym for the Annales school, which is, as most of us here should know or would know, a group of scholars who came about in France around the journal Annales, which emphasized the study of the past, not in terms of histoire événementielle, history from above of events, but history from below, a social history on the basis of large amounts of statistical information and various other types of archival materials. And so it's a revolutionary school of thought in European and universal historiography, I would argue. And Frenchness here is the emphasis that the French historians, particularly the ones I mentioned in my introduction, Henri-Jean Martin, as well as his instructor, his mentor. Henri-Jean Martin was a librarian, apparently, but his mentor, his true mentor, was Lucien Febvre, who was the co-founder of the Annales School. So the two of them wrote this famous book called L'apparition du livre, the coming of the book, translated in 1993 by the New Left Review Press, and since then has become really, really influential in the way people approach the history of print culture. And basically, the emphasis in L'apparition du livre is not on printing, on printers or individuals. It's on how many books were printed, how they were distributed, who distributed them, how much they cost, and especially on how they impacted the reader, the consumer of the book, at the moment of confronting the printed text itself. So it's a way of gauging people's mentality, their mentalité, on the basis of the kind of exposure they had to print culture. And that's what I like about this notion of Frenchness. Armenianness, on the other hand, is, for the most part, for understandable reasons, focused almost exclusively in the 20th century on printing establishments. This printer, that printer, Hagop Merabard or Voskan Yerevansi traveled and such a date to this place, established a printing press for 6 years, and then they printed the following books. But essentially, I don't want to give them a rough time here, but it's a rather limited way of looking at the history of the book that reduces it to printing alone, and that leaves open a whole host of questions like, how did the book transform the reader when the reader came face to face with it? What does the history of reading look like for Armenians? These are questions the Armenian school didn't even raise as questions, for the most part. The only exception, in my view, is Raymond Kevorkian, who actually was trained by none other than Henri Jean Martin. So I'm always jealous of Raymond for that fact that he had such a mentor. But so he's an exception, I would say. But on the whole, the emphasis is on colophons. It's not on notarial records. It's not on price of books. It's not on private libraries. All of these things I try to, in my own humble way, to rectify in the book. So what I want to do now today is, before it's too late, I want to give you a little sampling, a shrimp dumpling appetizer taste of the three basic arguments I make in the book, the three things that I think I feel legitimately proud of, the three contributions. The first contribution is the idea of how the early modern world for the Armenians started. And I use book history as a kind of lens to broach this topic and to explore it in ways that are somewhat innovative and new, if I may say so. So I'll talk about that very, very quickly, and I'll address the question of why there was a shift to begin with from manuscript production to print production. In other words, from scribal reproduction to mechanical reproduction, to use Walter Benjamin's famous phrase. This is a topic that the Armenianist doesn't really address because there's very little comparative work done, especially in Yerevan, for reasons that are understandable, but nonetheless in need of rectification. And then lastly, what I want to really focus on is, I think, the most interesting in my view, if there is something worthy in my book, it's the third part, which is why all this printing? Why were Armenians suddenly in the early modern period so why did they feel the need to publish and print one book after another? What's the driving engine of printing? Why print, right? Again, it's not a question that's been, in my opinion, analytically addressed and discussed. So my argument in my book is that confessionalism is the driving engine of Armenian book history. What is confessionalism, you might ask, and to which I will give you a short answer soon. But essentially, in a nutshell, confessionalism is the struggle that took place between the Armenian church and other Christian churches known as confessions in the early modern period, but predominantly against the Church of Rome, against the Roman Catholic Church, which had sent waves and waves of missionaries to the East to recoup losses that they had from the Protestants in the West. And of course, Armenians were the primary target for their ideal people to be converted. They're already Christian. There's no danger of converting them like there would be if you were trying to convert Muslims, etc. And of course, there is enough similarity between the two churches for the confession to operate on the level of translation, of making things seem like they were the same and easier for one to move from one side of the fence to the other. And the fence, of course, was not really there for much of the time. There was a difference between the two churches, but the difference became really rigid and impenetrable almost, very clearly defined in the period of the confessional struggles that took place in Europe and the Middle East, largely as a result of the global Reformation, which is basically Catholic Counter-Reformation, Protestant Reformation, exported to the rest of the world, largely through missionary networks of the Catholic Church. So I will talk about each one of these things very quickly now, but I'll start with a few words about the birth of the early modern Armenian world. The early modern period, of course, as some of you or most of you may know here, in general in world history begins in 1500 and is set to end about 1800. Obviously, it doesn't end on December 31st, 1799, and the next day when you wake up, 1800, January 1, we're out of the early modern period. It's not like that. There's a 15-year period that historians allow themselves for the fuzzy and messy side of history to work itself out. But generally speaking, it's 1500 to 1800. For the Armenians, I argue, the early modern world doesn't really begin in 1500 and doesn't end in 1800 as such, because it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Obviously, for the Armenian world, my argument is that the early modern world for the Armenians comes to them from outside as a result of global changes, but it comes to them 100 years after the fact. It comes to them, roughly speaking, in a tiny window of history, world history, from 1597 to 1607. I can say that if there's a birth certificate for the early modern period, and for when the Armenians entered this global period, it's this 10-year window. And why this 10-year window? Because this 10-year window witnesses the rise of two almost near cataclysmic events on the plateau where most of the Armenians lived. And obviously these are their ancestral lands, but other people also lived there. So when I say ancestral land or homeland, by no means do I imply some form of monopoly of ownership, right? I'm pretty ecumenical in that sense. So what are these two events? The two events are what are both detonations of mobility, forced mobility as I call them. The first one is what's known in Ottoman scholarship as the Büyük Kaçgın, or the Great Flight. Basically, this resulted in the 1599 to 1620 period, although historians debate about the exact parameters or perimeters even of this time period. But essentially, in this period, lawless, a bunch of bandits, for the most part, and former army officers rebelled against the Ottoman Empire for numerous reasons that have to do with global factors like the release of New World silver into the world market, which plunged the price of the akçe and caused inflation and so on, and also a climate of rebellion, to use the title of a well-known and decent book, supported by climate change in the early modern period, a global kind of the little ice age, as world historians call it, which caused crop failures and famine and so on. The result of this was that because of the uprising of rebels on the eastern frontiers of the Ottoman Empire, many of the Armenians who lived there, along with non-Armenians, were forced to leave. They were forced to migrate to the west in search of safety. They went to Constantinople, they went to Tekirdağ, Rodosto, they went to Izmir. So these three places became the hubs of what we would call, in retrospect, the origins of Western Armenian culture, of the Western Armenian diaspora. The Western Armenian diaspora begins in the early modern period precisely because of the Büyük Kaçgın. Simultaneous to the Büyük Kaçgın was another kind of Büyük event, large, and that is the Büyük Sürgün, which was basically, in Armenian, it's called Med Sürgün, Med's Derahanutun Gam Pernikart. But basically, the Büyük Sürgün refers to the orders given by Shah Abbas I, the most formidable Safavid ruler, who invaded Ottoman lands to recoup losses that the rulers before him had lost to the Ottomans in a series of non-stop wars, almost in the 1500s. And he did so precisely at the moment when he thought the Ottoman Empire was at its weakest because of the Jalali uprisings. So 1603, the Shah's army marched into across the Ottoman frontier. And as the Shah faced an attack, a counterattack by Ottoman forces coming in his way from the west, he basically ordered the burning to the ground of the entire region of where the Armenians lived, and along with others. This is called scorched earth policy. So that was done precisely to leave no blade of grass or wheat for the incoming soldiers or the armies. Is a very smart but very gruesome tactic of military warfare. And obviously, as a result of the Büyük Sürgün, Shah Abbas, as is well known, forcibly deported 300,000 Armenians and others. We don't know the exact figures. But historians now, I think, agree that 300,000 is probably the most logical number to arrive at. 300,000 Armenians were forced into Iran. Most of them died of typhoid and other diseases, pestilential. Others, a small elite taken to New Julfa, were groomed by the Shah to be his private merchants. And these merchants went on to establish a global diaspora of Eastern Armenians across the world. They're known as Julfan merchants. My first book was on them. And they basically single-handedly underwrote and financed the cultural renaissance of this period in the form of books and printing presses. So my larger argument in the book is that these two strands of the Western and Eastern Armenian diaspora have their origins precisely at this time of confessionalization, which I'll address in a second, and precisely in this time of incredible unrest on the plateau where the Armenians lived, which led to the Great Flight west and the Great Flight south, simultaneously giving rise to Western and Eastern Armenian diasporic communities, which in the long term, I argue 20, 30 years after their deportations, the members of each group met up in the port cities of the world in the burgeoning economy of archaic globalization. So Eastern and Western, you could find them in Madras, my favorite place, one of my favorite places. You can find them in Calcutta, Saidabad, anywhere in India you visit, you find Western and Eastern Armenians cohabiting the landscape. But this happened because of this twin detonation of mobility, forced mobility. The same also applies in Amsterdam. In terms of a case study of the perfect fusion of Eastern and Western elements in a port city setting. So, of course, the question is, why port cities? Why am I making a big deal out of port cities? I'm not going to mention any names, but a certain unmentionable person was on my case for a long time, in my view, unfairly attacking me for focusing on port cities, and he was saying, no, it's not really port cities, it's cities. Well, that's too general. That's too general a term. Port city is a kind of city. And so I argue that port cities are important to understand for understanding printing in Armenian printers because of what I call the PPP factor, or the PPP connection. It's easy to remember. Port Armenian, port city, and printer. So before I get into why this PPP is important, let me just throw a couple of facts in your direction. One, how many books were printed during this whole period, 1512 to 1800? We know that around 1,000 titles were printed in Armenian, mostly in classical Armenian, but a trickle in civil Armenian, Armeno-Turkish, and so on. But 1,000 titles in Armenian script. Out of 1,000 titles in Armenian script, if you do your math, and if you factor in 500 copies per book, which is a medium kind of tirage or print run, you will come up with 500,000 to 750,000 books in this entire period. Now, of course, in Europe, 250 million books were printed by the 1750s, and that's probably a low range. So there's nothing in comparison in terms of scale. You were dealing with a continent versus a very small nation, which Armenians have always been. So, but 500,000 copies of books is a huge number, considering that we only have 30,000 manuscripts that have survived today in all the collections across the world. And the actual number of manuscripts is probably not over 100,000, but it's just a wild guess, I'm guessing. I don't think it was in the millions for sure. So printing did make a difference. It's cheaper, faster, more efficient, and more portable. Probably the most important argument one can make about printing at this time. So there were 21 locations, as I said. In my book, I only have 19 locations. I missed a couple, but people make mistakes. In any case, out of the 19 locations, a clear 15, hands down, were in port cities. Hands down. Yes, you might say, well, I'm playing with port city concept here because I include fluvial ports in port cities, right? Riverine ports. Paris is a port city. It sits on a river. Vienna is a port city, sits on a river. Maritime port cities are also important. So 15 out of 20 to me, or in other words, 78.94% is a figure that one has to reckon with. You can't just dismiss it and say, oh, he's a sophist, or he's this or that. You have to deal with the facts. And the facts lead us to the direction that there's something here more than just an accidental confluence of historical things. There's a deeper structure here. Why port cities, you might say? Well, because of the PPP factor. In a nutshell, the PPP factor is that, for the most part, Armenian printing during this early modern period was a creature of port Armenians. Without port Armenian support, financially, logistically, morally, etc., or instructively, there'd be no printing revolution to speak of. So port Armenians, of course, lived in port cities. So that's the first important reason why printing and printers were attracted like a magnet to port establishments. The infrastructure was there from a diaspora's point of view. Second reason is because port cities in Europe, where printing flourished, were unusually located in such a way that they attracted the technical specialists. If you want to print a book, in my undergraduate classes, I always had, in the old days, I used to have a segment where I showed a video of actually what it looked like to print a book, right? Most people don't know. I'm a son of a printer and a grandson of a printer. My grandfather opened the first printing press in Ethiopia. So privately owned printing press. So I grew up around printing. So I know that in the old days, you had to have, of course, lead type. You had to use a matrix so that you could melt the lead and then have types. And then you would put the types on some kind of a contraption, and then that would be pulled down in the old days, Gutenberg era of printing, and it would leave the impression of the ink on the paper. But to do that, you need to have people to design types. You can't, types are not just, they don't drop into your lap from nowhere. So to do that, you need specialists who are highly trained. And those specialists in Europe almost always lived either in or close to port cities. That's the first thing. Second thing, you need also, in addition to punch cutters and so on, you need paper specialists. You need paper mills. Paper mills are almost always also close to port cities. And lastly, of course, you need to have transportation networks. And nothing is cheaper than transportation by water. That's a historical fact, no matter what period of history you look at. Because when you travel on water, if you're traveling with cannon on your ship like the Europeans did, you don't have to pay taxes. You just travel. You can sail across multiple zones. But if you're traveling cross land, you have to pay taxes at each customs post and so on. And it gets expensive and forbiddingly challenging for a printer. So those are the main reasons why I would argue port cities matter. I hope this is convincing, but if you're not convinced, I'm totally willing to sit down and say, yes, I'm wrong. If it is in fact the case. Let me just very quickly give you. I'll be very quick on this. I included this at the last minute. I gave a version of this talk in Armenian, Western Armenian, Yerevan recently, in the context of a war and ethnic cleansing, and I thought it was inappropriate for me to talk about history in this morose and depressing climate. But I thought one way I could justify it is if I said something that connected the past to the present. And that connection also offers me a chance to exemplify why port cities are important, and involves the most important, greatest Armenian printing center of the early modern world, which is in Amsterdam, the Dutch capital. Obviously, a center of the world system, the leading place in the world for commerce before the British took care of that. But in Amsterdam itself, the leading center of printing, there are three most important, there are four printing presses established between 1657 and 1617. So four continuous presses with a hiatus of 10, 15 years in the middle in one case. They published something like 60,000 books, right? Some of the best books in Armenian were published in Amsterdam. How many Armenians are we talking about in Amsterdam? How many would you guess if you had to take a guess? Ron, I'm going to pick on you. How many Armenians lived in Amsterdam?
Are you thinking?
1600s, at the peak of the Armenian presence in Amsterdam.
Oh, yeah, because I remember, let's see, I'm not that old, but
You don't have to give me the exact number.
300.
Too much.
Oh.
Too much. But respect, at least you didn't say 3,000.
I'm talking about half and quarter Armenians as well.
Yeah. Anyway, that's always a tricky issue. But there were no more than 40 to 60 permanent Armenian residents in Amsterdam, and they had 4 printing presses and 2 churches. Okay, 40. Think about that. 40. That's nothing. So it's always not a question of size. It's a question of the power of your punch. It's not how much you punch. It's what kind of punch you land. And in this case, these people were remarkable, right? So who are the founders? Mateusz Zaretzi. Where is he from? Mateusz Zaretzi is from a boondocks of the world. He comes from a town known as Tsar in Armenian, which happens to be, I'll give you $10,000, anyone who can guess where Tsar is today. I don't have that much money, but I'll tell you. Tsar is right next to Kelbajar, okay? It's known as Zar in our neighbor's terminology, Zar. The church where Mateusz Zaretzi preached is no longer around. The tombstones and so on are there in some school backyard. I found out through a friend of mine. But anyway, he came from this backwater place on the outskirts of Nagorno-Karabakh, the place which has seen the most fighting in the last 30 years. Unfortunately for all of its populations. Second founder. Matthias arrived in Amsterdam in 1557. He had gone to Rome to print the Armenian Bible, and everywhere he went, he was hitting his head against the wall and couldn't figure out why he was having so many obstacles. Everywhere there was an obstacle. And at one point in 1556, there was a moment when a lamba went off in his head. A little light bulb flashed. And he thought, I think the problem is that I'm in the wrong country. I'm in Rome, I'm in Italy. The Catholic Church is really pressing with its confessionalist agenda on the Armenians, and they're obviously putting up obstacles for the printing of an Armenian Bible. So he did what a smart person would do, what a Jewish person would do, which is to go to Amsterdam. The Jews had gone to Amsterdam from Italy in 1626. And of course, I don't know if Matthias knew this, I suspect he knew it, but he thought, I'm going to try the road to Amsterdam. And he went to Amsterdam, and before too long, he opened the first press, and that press was inherited by Voskan Yerevan, one of my favorite Armenian printers of the time, Catholic Armenian, although, of course, this is a sensitive issue for some people, but facts are facts. And then he was followed by Matthias and Thomas van Andeti. Thomas van Andeti is from Nakhichevan. And it comes from a place called Gohtan, a region of Nakhichevan called Gohtan, and a place called Vanand. And of course, as I mentioned it to my listeners in Armenia and Yerevan, I have no doubt that in a few years, we're going to be hearing about Matthias van Andeti and Thomas van Andeti as being Caucasian Albanians. I'm not surprised that this will, I fear this is going to happen because we're in for a long haul of revisionism involving anyone from this troubled region. So I did my duty here, ethical duty, to connect the past to the present. And I will quickly move on to the bulk of the book, which is on confessionals. And I mentioned this earlier, so I'll keep it short if I can. But basically, it's a term that was coined in 1979 and 1981 by two German scholars, Heinz Schilling and Wolfgang Reinhardt. In the late 1970s, there's a term that was used as an umbrella concept for understanding the complexity of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation as part of a single process, as part of a larger history that didn't need to be compartmentalized. And basically, in essence, what it means is the hardening of confessional distinctions between churches. And that means like things that in the past used to be unclear or muddy or blurry between two separate Christian churches in their confessions. We call them sects sometimes. In the past, when things were muddy or unclear, in this period of confessional strife, characterized by the missionaries fanning across the Ottoman Empire, Soviet Iran, to basically make up for their losses with Armenian converts. When you had, at the end of this process, was a clear hardening, where you couldn't pretend to be an Armenian member of the Armenian Church and a Catholic at the same time. You could just be one or the other. You couldn't be bouncing back and forth or dancing across the line, which a lot of Armenians were doing. But by the early 1700s, that became an impossibility because both sides clamped down, and it culminated with the absolute ban on communicatio in sacris by the Roman Church, which meant Armenian Catholics in the Ottoman Empire could not attend on the pain of death apostolic churches, which they had been doing prior to that. And this ban clearly rigidified the boundaries. So, is there an Armenian confessionalism? Yes, obviously there is. And that confessionalism is basically as a result of connected history of Catholic missionaries coming to their backyards. And that begins, roughly speaking, 1640 and ends, one would think, in 1800. But when I started my research, I thought Armenian confessionalism was dead in the water by the end of the 18th century. And I thought, wow, kudos for that. But then it turns out that no, the Armenian confessional struggles continued well into the 1850s, 1860s. So a century late and a century late as well. So what are the main differences between the Armenian Church and the Catholic Church? Now, I don't have enough time to go into this, but I can give you some bullet points. First, I didn't know any of this before I started writing this book, so I've been really immersing myself in too much theological doctrine for my own sanity, perhaps, but it's been educational. I learned quite a few things. So obviously, the main differences between the Armenian Church, Apostolic Church as it's known now, or the Gregorian Church as it was known in the 18th century, and their Roman Catholic brethren, and their Byzantine brethren, and their Georgian brethren, was that, or sisters as well, was that in the Armenian case, of course, the Armenians absolutely rejected the Council of Chalcedon. Everybody has heard of the Council of Chalcedon, however one pronounces it, 451 CE. The Armenians were not even present at that council. It was an ecumenical council. The church met in a place that Ethem Eldem lives in today. Chalcedon is Moda today. I didn't know about this. I learned recently in Istanbul. It's one of the suburbs of Istanbul. But at that council, the church hierarchy basically decided that Christ had two natures in one, perfect. The Armenian church rejected that, and the Armenian church basically calls to this day, or I'm not sure if to this day, but used to call Catholic Armenians or Catholics as duophysites because they believed in two natures. The Armenian church is known for its miaphysite, monophysite / miaphysite Christological argumentation. So that's the most important difference. But there are other differences, including such really important things as the famous filioque controversy. Filioque is whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, filioque. And of course, I don't expect anyone here to know this, but the Armenian Church rejected filioque. The Armenian Church believes that the Holy Spirit only proceeds from the Father, period. And of course, yes, patriarchy could be an explanation there, but also whether the Pope was the supreme pontiff or not, right? Catholicos. The Armenians have their own Catholicos. They don't want to be subject to a Pope from a foreign land. And interestingly enough, this other controversy known as in Armenian, and this is one of these $100 words that I picked up recently, Anabag Pajag, Anabak Bajak, which means the unmixed chalice. Now, the unmixed chalice is anyone who's been a Catholic, has been to a Catholic church in the last 10, 15 years, will know that if you go to Catholic church and you take the communion, the wine for Catholics is always broken with water, always. It's called the mixed chalice. It's hot wine. It's wine with hot water, mixed. It's a way of diluting it, right? That's a matter of faith and principle for the Catholic Church. The Armenian Church rejects this categorically. And up until the early 19th century, people used to kill each other on the question of whether you had enough water mixed in the chalice with the wine for communion or you didn't. The wafer also had to be different for the Armenians, right? So these are huge. To us, they seem like puny differences, but people actually built identities on the basis of these differences. And of course, not to be left aside completely, the issue of what happens to the soul after one dies. I wrote a very long essay recently that's going to appear in Le Muséum the next year, I hope. And it's basically on the question of this, what happens after the soul dies, right? For the Armenians, for the Catholic Church, you have purgatory. You have heaven, hell, and purgatory. Purgatory was born in the 13th century, as Jacques Le Goff explains in his famous book. The Armenians categorically reject purgatory. In place of purgatory, they accept the idea of a station or a kayan, which is something that a 14th century Armenian theologian came up with in competition with the Catholics. So these are the small things on the surface, but they're actually quite big. And during the age of confessionalism, both sides went to printers to propagate their message. The Armenian Church had its merchants, Khojas, the Port Armenians on its side. The Catholic Armenians had their own merchants and their own printers on their side. So each side dueled with the other. And the result was 1,000 titles, majority of which are confessional. So how many of them are confessional, you might say? I'll skip this. Well, a general figure that I did, my methodology in part is based on Kevorkian, so I don't want to short shrift my friend. But Kevorkian examines 200 books from 1512 to 1695. in my tabulation, statistical, I examined 1,000 books. So the majority of books were published after Kevorkian's period had long ended. But in my estimate, religious books make up 70% of the entire production, 1512 to 1800. But if you zoom in closer, you start noticing interesting patterns with the numbers. And this is the annal scholarship that's coming into play here because of the idea of histoire quantitative or serial, like serial history or quantitative history, which are based on crunching data and coming up with large patterns that would be invisible to the naked eye if one didn't resort to statistical quantitative information. So one of the things one notices is that while 70% is the total range for the whole period, but if one looks at the publications after 1700, where Raymond Kevorkian's analysis ends, he comes up with 72% for 1695. And when I was looking at my own analysis, I thought, geez, I'm going to look at 30%. By the time my period is over, it's going to be 20%. I was like, there are going to be no religious books published by the 18th century. They're all secular because the Armenians I like, the ones in India, are all secular. And the information I was getting was that they were all interested in secular books, histories, geographies, travel books, and so on. But I started having doubts. So I said, let me count, because it's one thing to say a generality. It's another thing to actually back it up with data. So I started counting and I started getting more and more depressed. The more I counted, the more the confessional curve rose, like almost through the roof. I mean, at one point, 84% of all the published printed books were on confessional and religious topics. 84%. Think about that figure. But of course, 78% in the 1700s, first decade, 1700 to 1710, 80% in the 1710s, 1740s, 84%, and then it goes down to 61% by the 1790s. So what was happening in these periods, you might ask? Well, the clear-cut thing is 1700s, that's when confessionalism came to the Armenians with a vengeance. In Istanbul, Constantinople, 1701, September 8th, every good Catholic Armenian should know this date. September 8th, 1701 is when Mkhitar Appahai, the founder of the Mkhitarist order, established his congregation in Bolis. It was at a time when the Sheikhul Islam, Feyzullah Effendi of the Ottoman Empire, a confessionalizer in his own right, confessionalizing, Sunnitizing the Ottoman Empire vis-a-vis others, especially Shiites, but also others. He had placed his own candidates on the patriarchal throne. So one after another, rabid confessionalizing anti-Catholic Armenian patriarchs sat on the throne, and this created the birth of the Catholic order of Mkhitarist in Venice, another two orders in Syria and Lebanon, the Zimmar Andonians and the Zimmarians, all born in the first decade. So that's why you notice a spike in books, 78% at this point. So, and of course, you might ask, what kind of books are these books? Are they just blandly religious? No, they're actually devotional books. They're catechisms that are specific to the Armenian Church and its liturgy, and so forth. So you can have the breakdown of all the genres or subgenres. And I'll conclude by just revisiting the topic of confession and nation. And in the course of writing this book, basically, I thought, when I wrote this book initially, I thought I want to make a robust contribution to Armenian nationalism. But what am I going to say that nobody else has said? I started my career in the 1990s. I was going to say 1890s, 1990s at the New School, wanting to be a specialist on nationalist discourse. And I wrote a master's thesis on Nagorno-Karabakh. And soon I realized it was too uncomfortable for me. I moved back into history to be safe. But history has its own way of pulling you back. So anyway, when I started, I was interested in nationalist discourse. And I thought, what can I say that hasn't been said in nationalism? And at first, I thought I had something. And then eventually, anyway, my argument in a nutshell is that Armenian nationalism has often been traced back to the 19th century, and Armenians have been seen by the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, as a community that was ethno-religious that became suddenly secular, or not suddenly, but that became secular. But the key word here is ethno-religious, and I emphasize and underline religious. I like the Armenian church, I categorically reject the filioque of ethno-religious categorization, because I think the Armenians have never been ethno-religious. They've been ethno-confessional. We've had the wrong unit of analysis in our minds, I would argue. Why not ethno-religious? Because a problem for the Armenians is not with other religions. The problem for Armenians, especially in the last 500 years, has been with other confessions, not other religions. The problem is with the Roman Catholic Church, with the Mkhitarist congregation of Armenians. Their problem was with the Georgian Church. Their problem was with the Orthodox Church of Byzantium. Their problem is not with Buddhists or Muslims or I don't know what other religion. It's the wrong category. Religion is not the right category. Confession is the category, I would argue. And so confession becomes a category when one looks at the output of books, and confession also becomes a category when one looks at collective Armenian identity, right? Armenians are ethno-confessional, and the first imaginings they had of a nation, of being a collective dispersed across the diaspora, was that of being an ethno-religious, ethno-confessional community. Print was used to shore up and imagine an ethno-confessional Armenian nation. So it's a confessional nation. So the book ends on that note where I think I make a small contribution by saying that we have to go back to the early modern origins of this and look at the ethno-confessional underpinnings of what later on became secularized post-Tanzimat. Just to give you a last word on this, 1863, obviously the Armenian National Constitution in Istanbul, but 1879, 15 years or so after the Constitution and after the Tanzimat reforms, you have a bunch of Armenian intellectuals and writers, especially one of my favorite nationalists. I'm not a friendly person with nationalism, but the one person I do like, because he's smart, again, credit to where it's due, is Rafi, a really interesting novelist and writer, intellectual of his time. And he says, in a famous editorial that he wrote for the newspaper Mashag, he says that in the old days, Catholics were not considered Armenians. Protestants were certainly not considered Armenians. But he says, now, our nation has come a long way, because for us, the category of what constitutes belonging to a nation is no longer religion or confession. It's actually race, it's language, it's belonging to a land, etc., etc. So there's a shift to a more modern understanding of nation that happens. And I think it's that shift that takes us from the confessional underpinnings of the early modern period, to which print capitalism or print capitalism doesn't exist in the Armenian context. It's print patronage. They say print patronage shifts, establishes the basis for an imagined community of confessional nation that then becomes secularized in the 19th century because of largely in the post-Tanzimat era. So I'll end my talk here, and thank you for your patience.
Will you take some questions?
I'll take any questions you have. Yes. Yes. Could you tell me your name so I can fix you in?
My name is Samet.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this super stimulating talk. My head is full of ideas right now, but I'll ask 2 questions.
Sure.
First, let me give you a sampling of Diaspora about Marseille. The founder of the first Ottoman language printing press, Ibrahim Müteferrika,
Yes, of course.
in the 1720s,
Yeah.
had to rely
29.
on an Armenian master, an Armenian technical expert, to design his lead typefaces and the other technical stuff. And as far as I know, also in later periods, it was common to see Armenian technical experts again in working in other printing houses. So, like, I think the first question that I have is like the impact of Armenian expertise in printing press and the technical knowledge outside of the outside of the Armenian book in global.
Okay. Yeah.
And the second question is, like, I'm also curious about the book trade. So you showed us this nice map at many different port cities where the Armenian books were produced. But say, did the books produced in Leipzig at a market in Anatolia or India?
Yes.
So what was going on again in the larger scale of mobility and globalization in book trade? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Summit, right?
Yes, Summit.
Okay. So I was not aware of that. I studied Ibrahim Mutaferrika's press. I've read the secondary literature as much as I can, as much as I could. But I wasn't.
The Armenian master now escapes my.
I can tell you what it is.
Mugurdic, yes, Mugurdic.
Really?
Yeah.
He also drew some of his
Of Karabakh?
of Galata.
Galata, I see. Okay, wow.
He also drew some of his maps.
I didn't know that. Okay, that's fascinating. The reason it's fascinating is because, and to respond to your question, it's not an area that I left out the Ottoman Empire to a large extent. I could have devoted a whole chapter on print in Istanbul, but I didn't. It's not my expertise, and let's be honest. I felt uncomfortable dealing with Ottoman Armenian issues, and I still do. But I know this much, that Istanbul had something like 40 printers, Armenian printers at one point in the 18th century. That's a huge number. Istanbul is really, really important. And, but of course, they were almost always playing second fiddle to Venice. Venice, San Lazzaro, my favorite island, midget Armenian monks, Catholic Armenian monks, Machitarists, sing a population of 80 Armenians, okay, like Amsterdam, maybe one or two more. 80 Armenians produced as many books and much better quality books than Istanbul, okay? Throughout the whole period, they were neck to neck. 80 Armenians in Venice outpacing the rest of the Ottoman Armenians. But to come to your question, did Armenian printing have an impact? Armenian punch cutters or designers and so on have an impact outside of their narrow circles? And the answer is probably a very cautious but robust yes. And the reason is because one of those printers in Istanbul was a printer by the name of Araboğlu, I think. I could be wrong, but one family had possession of printing, a kind of like a monopoly of sorts, for over 100 years. And that family, I think they were also pioneers in casting Arabic script. Like the casting part is the most difficult, the most expensive part. But they were masters of Ottoman style print. Whether they were involved with Mutaferrika, who is a Hungarian convert, or not, I don't know. But for anyone interested to do a PhD with me, I have about 300 never before seriously read letters by the Araboğlu family that's sitting in an archive and waiting for someone who wants to put some time into it. So if you're listening out there, contact me.
Okay.
But books in Leipzig only produced one book. And it's used often to overthrow my theory of port cities. But it's one book, and absolutely no, to use the riverine or water analogy, I would say it's even less than a drop in the galactic ocean. Okay, there was a book specially produced for local consumption of Orientalists. So no Armenian in the Ottoman Empire would be reading a book in Leipzig. But Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, including in Dikranagert and other places in the east, read regularly in their churches and in everyday encounters. They regularly came across Voskan Yerevantsi's Bible and all the books that the Armenians in Amsterdam printed. So all those books were shipped via caravan by water first from Amsterdam to Izmir to north to Istanbul, and then or Izmir to the east via caravan where they would be consumed by people. And even if there was no individual consumer, someone would eventually bring a copy of the book, of a printed book, so that villagers in some backwater place wouldn't be shocked and they wouldn't fall down to the ground at the sight of a printed book, right? There's a famous episode in Joseph Amin's The Life and Adventures of Joseph Amin, an Armenian, written in English by himself, 1792 in London, where he mentions going to a small town called Ginis at the time. Today it's called Khanus. It's not too far from Erzurum. So he goes into this town, and then people have a completely distorted idea of what Armenian history is like. They don't know anything. They haven't heard anything about Armenian kings. And he pulls out of his pocket, he has a very nice hefty coat, pulls out of his pocket a printed edition of Moses Khorenatsi, the first Armenian historian, printed in Amsterdam in 1699. And I know it's the Amsterdam edition because I've examined all the editions. The Amsterdam edition is the size of my palm. It could fit into a pocket. The other editions are bulky. So at that moment, the villagers see a printed book. They don't fall down to the ground. They've seen printed books before. But I exaggerate, I elaborated too much. Anybody else? Yes, I forget your name.
We are very pleased to be here.
Okay.
My name is Helmut Hoffmann.
Helmut, okay, yes, okay, yes.
I'm an early modern historian of Western Europe, and that is where I'm coming from. And I think that, you know, your argument would sort of thrive on the version of confessionalism that we now see more clearly come to the fore,
Okay.
which is not what Wolfgang Beinhardt and Schilling sort of conceived of in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It is rather a slightly downsized version of confessionalism in the sense that we've now learned through the research of Benjamin Kaplan, Delotz Heimann, and others, many others, that there were, you know, people we never saw, namely people who didn't have a confession. They existed.
Okay.
Most people lived in bi-confessional contexts of some kind. They had to come to an understanding, to a peaceful coexistence with their neighbors.
Mhm.
There is not this road, the clear road to identity formation that Reinhardt and Schilling saw. It is not that confessionalism is
Sure.
no longer sort of as telling about the early modern period. It's a slightly revisited, resized version of confessionalism that has come to the fore. And I think for your diasporic context, that would actually benefit, you know, because when you look at Protestant communities, there's a very similar situation in some ways. Calvinists were a minority in many places, and but they were well connected. And book trade is one of the ways in which they actually connected. So I think, you know, that new version of confessionalism, I mean, the downsized version, if I may call it
Sure.
that, it's sort of would be of additional
I think
benefit.
I think that's an excellent intervention. I'm very thankful for you for making it. I don't look. Confessionalism has been around as a category of analysis or a way of thinking for at least 50 years. I don't know. It's
Yeah, I mean,
1980,
older versions
about
that go back to
half a
50s,
century,
60s.
about half a century, let's say,
Yeah,
at least.
and
Right?
that clear from
So
like
like
this earlier.
any of these concepts, Orientalism included, of course, it's going to have, nothing is forever, right? It's going to have important pushbacks by smart people. And there have been considerable pushback even on the idea of confessionalism in Europe. I'm leaving aside whether confessionalism is the right tool for the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, there are a lot of people who don't think that's the case. Tijana Kristic was the person who introduced us to the Ottoman world of confessionalism, and I'm a great fan of her work. But I'm also aware that there are a lot of people who don't buy into that argument. And often enough, these include some smart friends of mine. Often enough, I have to say, I don't buy their argument, because one of them was recently telling me, you know, you're riding you're flogging a dead horse. Confessionalism is a dead horse. And I said, well, it might be a dead horse in Europe, but the horse has not even been ridden once in the prior part of the world that I study. And I think it's worth riding this horse. It's a really interesting horse. So,
Can I ask?
and of course, there are also other differences, like in the Armenian context, you don't have states. You have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Sheikh al-Islam, that's one clear case of top-down confessionalism. But more than likely, in most cases, it's bottom-up, and it's trans-border activity. It's not state-confined, which is largely what it is in Europe. So there are a lot of, but these things are in the literature. People don't think it's top down anymore in Europe. So I see what you're saying, and I agree with you. Their
Let me just
qualification.
add
Please,
something.
yes.
I mean, what is in discussion and in debate, in those people who care about confessionalization, which is a small minority, but it's very powerful. Anyway, so it's an important concept still, but what is a little bit not as clear as Weinhardt and Schilling saw it is this link to modernity. You know, kind of,
Okay.
you know, that is much more questionable, sort of this
Yeah.
trajectory, you know, because they saw confessionalism as this road that connected the early modern history that they were studying to the modern world of nations and identity
yeah.
formations.
Which is kind of ironic because, and I have to say, the other semi-original part of my book is that I have a 5-6 page section where I critique Benedict Anderson.
Mm.
And again, I thought Ben Anderson, who can critique Ben Anderson? It's a classic, you know, there've been so many attempts, but I think I have a point that's somewhat original in the sense that if you read the book really closely, there's not even an inkling of an awareness that print capitalism was often, if not more often, in the service of confessionalized identities than of secular nations, right? Confession doesn't even show up once in his book. Religion is given short shrift. Short shrift. I mean, he says he uses the term, I don't want to be misunderstood, but you know, when people say they want to be misunderstood, they actually know they're going to be correctly understood as being wrong in this case. So confession is not there in imagined communities whatsoever, but obviously the Protestant Reformation is a clear-cut case. And there are several case studies of nations in Europe that were built on a confessional basis and on the engine of print capitalism. So just putting it out there. But thank you. I really appreciate your intervention. Michael, and then Catherine.
Well, thank you, Sebouh, for a great talk and a magnificent book. I wanted to ask, since you began with Nepal.
Since I what?
You began with Nepal.
Yes.
It says that you can't write a book without language.
Yeah.
If you could talk more about what role does language play in the confessional nation that you're envisioning? Because you have classical Armenian, like you said, and then you also have civil Armenian, the pre-modern vernacular, like you said. And then you also have Middle Armenian, the other pre-modern Armenian vernacular. So how do these things help to shape these audiences across this huge diasporic space that you sketched for us?
Okay, let me see if I can.
Sure.
Can you flip one or two slides? As a backup, I had something like this in mind, so I didn't want to use it, but here we have an outdated chart in terms of language, right? These are blurry. I don't think they're reliable anymore. I have to also say my grad student, Daniel Ohanian, did all my graphic work and he did all the statistical analysis. Without him, I would not have produced these charts or concretized my ideas. But the methodology, of course, is straight from Robert Darnton. Okay, years of reading Robert Darnton as a grad student implanted these ideas in my mind. So according to I don't know when this was 2016, I think, but roughly speaking, it's a rough guide to this galaxy. 90% of all the books printed, the 500,000 books, 90% are squarely classical Armenian. Okay, about 4%, the second largest language group is Armeno-Turkish, which is basically Turkish, Anatolian Turkish, not Ottoman highfalutin Turkish, but Anatolian low-registered Turkish, written in Armenian script, which is actually the vernacular for the Armenians. And most people would say of reading, let's say, Ben Anderson and say, well, the age of vernacularization is the 18th century, my friend. Where were you guys in the 18th century, right? And I was thinking about this as well. I thought we're like 100 years, we are 100 years behind or late because vernacularization we always associate with Ashkharapar in the 19th century. But the real vernacular that Armenians used was Armeno-Turkish. It's basically Anatolian Turkish, low-registered Turkish, written in Armenian characters. So 4% of all the books are squarely in that camp. And then, of course, you have vernacular, you have classical and vernacular, classical and Armeno-Turkish, the boundaries become even more and more blurry. But to answer your question in a quick way, classical Armenian is the main game in town. I think everybody's writing classical as much as they can. And those who can't write in classical, I mean, we've had this discussion before, write in a new language that was concocted in the 18th century as a result of late 17th, 18th centuries, as a result of the democratizing trend within print culture itself, that consisted of what my favorite Soviet Armenian historian, a solid through and through Marxist, the guy who translated Das Kapital into Armenian the first time, Dateos Avdalbekyan. I'm sure you know of that name, Ron.
Not personally, but
But he was the first who translated volume 1 of Das Kapital, and he was the best scholar on Armenians in India. Really a phenomenal character, but sent to Siberia by his colleague and friend, who then put his name on the book that he had worked on for most of his life. A familiar story in 1937. But anyway, this guy, Tadeos Avdalbekyan, calls this new language Macharonik Grapar, which is macaronic classical Armenian. It's classical Armenian mixed with huge elements of Turkish, Kurdish, Arabic, Persian, etc., and foreign words. So Macharonik Grapar plays an important role in this. But the people who write it are merchants, and they know very well that they can't write to compete with the priestly class. We were having this discussion earlier. I'm a huge fan of Dana Sarji, despite a lot of criticism she's faced. But nonetheless, the register in which these new writers write, the merchants, is this kind of vernacularized classical. But when they write it, they're very well aware that they're oafs. They're like country bumpkin. And they know this because constantly they stop and they say, "Dear reader, please forgive me. I'm only a merchant. I know how to buy cheap and sell expensive." This is Shamir. And then they say, "I don't even know the rules of declension. I don't even know the difference between the p and the b and the d and the t. I make spelling mistakes constantly. I can't do verb subject agreement, that kind of thing." So they're begging for forgiveness because they know that their readers, the highfalutin Vartabeds, the ulama of the Armenian world, are, first of all, not in agreement with a lot of their ideas. So they're going to use whatever they can to demote them. So there is this, but it's a tiny element. There I don't know how many books, but I would say maybe 15, 20 books are published in this kind of civil Armenian language, which is a hybrid of classical and modern. Anybody else? Oh, Catherine, yes.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the non-statistical Frenchness.
Yeah.
To think about the Histoire de Livre
Right.
In terms of your readership
Yeah.
and the kind of effect that it had. I mean, you started talking about it a little bit
Yeah.
at the end of in answer to Michael, right? About how it affects the way
Yeah.
in which the merchants themselves or patrons represent themselves in writing. And the Joseph Amin story was a good anecdote. Could you tell us a little bit more really about reception?
Reception. Well, okay. It's a very difficult topic, obviously. But I would say this much. Can you switch to 3 slides earlier? Yeah, that, right. Well, 1 slide up. Yeah, let's stop here. I'll say this much. To write a history of reading for the non-quantitative annals style, which is really important, you need to have access to private merchant libraries, right? And of course, there are dozens, hundreds of them, if not thousands in Europe, because the notarial records and inventories of estates. In the Armenian world, I spent the last 15, 20 years combing through so many archives, and I've come up with 10 to 15 inventories of estates of private merchant libraries, okay? And here is the most interesting one in my view. This is a library belonging to this gentleman here with his slick hair in the back, not wearing a hat, He's an Armenian from Amsterdam. I knew this much. Somebody had sent me this photo from the cellar of the gallery, National Gallery of Art in Armenia. But I didn't know who this guy was, what his name was, or where he was from. I assumed Amsterdam because he was among a group of portraits from Amsterdam, the Armenian church. And then 4 years ago, I was at the British Library, and in one of the manuscripts there, I forget which manuscript, I was going through it, and I came across two inventories of two private libraries inventorized by a very shady and interesting imposter of an Armenian by the name of Shahan Cherben. Nobody ever talks about him now. Maybe it's better that way, but a very interesting character who was hired by Napoleon to teach Armenian at one of the first Oriental schools in Paris. And anyway, so he visited Amsterdam at some point. I didn't know it was Amsterdam, but he put together two inventories. One for a private merchant by the name of Stepan Di Gabrielian. His name in European sources is Etienne de Gabriel. And another one for the Amsterdam Church, the Armenian Church of Holy Spirit in Amsterdam. Two inventories. The church had 110 books. Stepan Di Gabrielian, a merchant, had 96. And you start going down his list, right? And what's interesting about this, there are a lot of confessional books, not a huge amount as we would have, if he had lived 100 years earlier, he would have been drowning in confessional books. But he has, Jashutz, Min Hayotz, Jashutz Kirk, whatever. It's a ritual, it's a confessional, it's a book that is useful in the church setting. And then he has Aslanian Voskanian. I can read it because I remember this list. That's a Boskan Bible in Venice. And then you have, I can't read it here, but I think it's on the next page. He has 3 volumes of Mikhail Chamchan's History of the Armenians. He has Agatan Keros, History of the Armenians, 1669 Amsterdam. He has 3 or 4 or 5 other histories. He has books on geography. He has books on travel, and so on. So the composite image that emerges from a non-quantitative study is based on inference, of course, and that this man is a post-confessional reader. And there are very few of them. But in his case, his inventory was made in the 1810s or 20s. We don't know for sure. But to jump to the chase, what's interesting is that when I was in Armenia 3 weeks ago, I had this image, and I have a friend, a colleague who works at the National Gallery, and she said, anytime you need anything, please send me an email. I'll be happy to help. So I said, okay, look, I have these images. I got them 15 years ago. I don't know who they are. Do you think you can give me a history of how they ended up in your collection? And she's looked at it, and then an hour later, I get this email, and I get this image, and it says Stepan Di Gabriel on it. So I've had this guy's image in my computer and showed it to my students for 10 years without knowing that the inventory I've been working on is actually this man's. And so it's difficult to come up with I didn't give you a proper answer, but it's possible to do it, but only on the basis of libraries, I think, mostly, or book reviews, or ego documents that a person leaves behind about how he interpreted a certain book. I also have an essay on Joseph Emin, where I have a book review of Emin's book published in Astrakhan, the first Armenian paper in Madras, 1794-96, which is written by a country bumpkin, again, a merchant whose Armenian is actually much worse than Shamirian's, much worse. You can barely understand it. And he writes a book review of Emin based on his encounter with another merchant, and he slams the book. Right? So you have these rare documents, exceptional normal documents. But it's an exceedingly difficult but important task. Yes, Hakim.
Yes, thank you very much. This is really mind-provoking. And the connections are just amazing. I visited Amsterdam church, by the way.
Oh, very nice.
So I was just wondering, you already answered my first question about Benedict Anderson, so I wondered about that.
Okay.
So thank you for this. But about the economics of it, who bought these books? How profitable was it when you have not many Armenians in Amsterdam?
Yes.
And so many printing presses. So this is my first question.
Okay.
The second one is about the confessional books that statistics. I'm just wondering, were they classical liturgical books,
Yes,
or were they recently written for the purpose of preventing further conversion to Catholicism?
both. I would say both. But the first question, what was your first?
Economics of it.
The economics of it. Yes, it's mind-boggling because, Armenians are a small nation, not just in terms of geography between two empires, which is a fate that they have, like colors everything about their imagination, everything, I would say. But they're a small nation also in terms of numbers. They've always been a small nation.
That did great deeds.
They have done great deeds, yes, and to use
I'm just quoting someone.
yes, a friend of yours who's also my friend. But to quote another person, although we are small, although we are few, they call us Armenian, Bari Sebouh, right? To Moses Chorenatim Bari Sebouh, 1600-year difference, and yet they're both talking about smallness. Because being a small nation is a curse, but it's also a blessing in some cultural ways, but that's another issue. But to go back to your question, numbers. So 500,000 books, who was reading? Were there 500,000 readers? I doubt it. Literacy levels in the Armenian world until the 1890s, if not the Sovietization period, I'm willing to say until the mid-20th century. No, until the watering down of the alphabet and the kind of like Bolshevikization of Armenian spelling, which most Western Armenians find horrendous, until that period, 1920 to 22, which was done to increase literacy in the Soviet Union, of course, I would say literacy levels were minuscule in the Armenian world, minuscule. Maybe 10%, maybe 15, 20%. I don't think it was much larger. I could be wrong. I'm not a scholar of literacy. But across the world, they were down, very low. So, of course, the question is in the 1800s, with such a tiny population, we don't even know how many Armenians there were, but definitely less than 1 million. Definitely, I would say. Maybe 1 million, 1,200,000, I'm not sure, depending on who counts as an Armenian, but that's another issue. So out of that, if 15% are literate, that means that there are probably maybe 100, 200,000 people who can read, but there are 500,000 copies of books. So how do you reckon that? Was there such a thing as an individual consumer of books? Individual. And to that, I would say the jury is still out, but I would say the church was the biggest consumer. All these books ended up in churches. They ended up being donated as gifts by merchants to churches, their favorite congregation, the church they went to, and so on. And in a few cases, there are cases of portable psalters, portable karos kirks, catechisms, and so on, which merchants did carry. And portability is a huge, big deal, I would say. Why? Because we're living in the age of mobility. And unless you actually touch the book that you're studying, physically hold it, play with it, and so on, you won't fathom it. You won't fathom it. Recently, 8 months ago, I made a huge purchase. I'm a huge collector of old Armenian books. Like I have three shelves of Armenian classics. I own most of Mkhitar's publications. So it's one of my vices. So I bought a series of books on eBay, and when they arrived and I unpacked them, I held one of them in the palm of my hands, and I thought, man, if I hadn't ordered this book, I wouldn't have known why this book is so small. It's small because you can carry it in your pocket. It's a pocket-size edition. But unless you actually see it, you won't know it. But so merchants were the consumers. They gifted books. Sometimes for reasons of prestige, right? Because they wanted to have a good standing, their social capital, to use Bourdieu terminology. They wanted to increase their social capital with other merchants because they were financing books. And why were they also financing books, you would say? Well, a large reason for that is that it goes back to confessionalism and to the Armenian doctrine of the Gayan, the station in between the two worlds. The Armenian church doesn't believe that you die and there's a judgment. The Armenian church believes that there's only one judgment, one final judgment. There are no particular judgments. The Catholic Church believes that when you die, your soul is judged and you go either to hell, heaven, or purgatory if you have some sin. The Armenian church says, no, there's only one judgment in this town. It comes at the end of time, and Christ pronounces it. And until then, every soul that has died, every soul goes to this place called the Kayan. You stand on the right side or the left side of Christ in the station, in the celestial station. It's like a train station. If you're on the right side, you're basically in good shape. If you're on the right side, when the final judgment comes, if people say enough prayers for you, if people donate enough books in your name, if people remember your name in colophons, if people build churches with your name inscribed, when that final judgment comes, you can have an easier time of joining Christ in the eternal life. But if you're on the left side, woe to you, because on the left side, you are going to have a sinister fate. And I use that word on purpose. Sinistra, Latin, Italian, leftist. Leftists did not do well in the Old Testament. So in Armenian as well, tzachrig is someone who's a failure. Tzachort, right? Left. It has to do with the left position. So why did people donate so many books? Because they want to write colophons with the names of their relatives. Because remembering a name or walking over a tombstone, I specialize in tombstones, walking over a tombstone and reading a person's name, and if it says Hishya is there, whatever, like remember to the Lord, you remember that name, and they believe that that would accelerate that person's chances of going to salvation, the salvation of the soul. So I call this the salvific economy of the salvific economy of cultural patronage. People patronize things because of the salvific economy. But I gave you a long answer. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your name again. There again.
Jevad. Yeah. So this is really amazing, and I have a very local and locally based small point about your argument about nationalism and confessionalism. In Kurdish, the word "fle" is Christian, but locally it also means Armenian. So if you want to, "fle" is Armenian and Christian, then you don't have separate words for Christian and Armenian.
Okay.
But the word for the word Turk is Sunni and Turk. So there is a confessional division when it comes to divisions within Islamic society, but externally it's the same single word. So from the Kurdish perspective, whether you are different, you belong to a different confession within Christianity, doesn't really make sense. It's all the same. So Armenian will be Protestant or different.
But was that terminology used before the 19th century, or is this?
I mean, this is
contemporary.
Contemporary.
Yeah. Okay.
So I was wondering whether the affiliation with confessionalization is not necessarily a negation of religion, ethno-religious identity, because ethno-religious identity is also an external naming. So I wonder if you, if that both are kind of simultaneous processes within Christian society. Confessionalism plays a role, whereas externally, as long as you are Christian, because for Muslims, being being a Muslim Christian, a Muslim Armenian is unimaginable, right? If you are a Muslim Armenian, there is something wrong. You gotta, you have either been forced to.
I have a feeling even Rafi, the person I mentioned earlier, even Rafi would have objected to that. I have a feeling because he was open for Catholics and Protestants to be called Armenian, and not to consider religion or confession as a part of what belongingness. But I have a feeling that would have been a bridge too far. But sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, so this is something that I have been dealing with in my own research, because the state elite comes and say these people are confused in naming Turks as this way, Armenians this way, and Armenians call the Kurds this good. So I wonder if there is, this is something that I deal with, that whether there are the ethno-religious and the ethno-confessional processes do not negate each other. They kind of they function in parallel to one another. the process of confessionalization and the association of ethnicity or race with religion in the modern period are taking place simultaneously. I hope that
It's something to clearly ponder on. I would have to think more about it, but I think from looking at it from an outsider perspective, emic or ethic, I forget which one it is in anthropology. I always confuse the two, but I think you would not see it as confession. You just see religion.
Yes.
And even to the to just think on my toes right now, I can say the word for confession in Armenian is davanank or tavanank, depending on whether you're Western or Eastern. And that word itself was coined. It's a coinage in the early modern period, exactly when the confessional strife is beginning. They borrow it from European languages. But in the 18th centuries and 19th centuries, it's fairly rare to come across davanank. Although it's there in the 18th century for sure. 19th century, I've seen gronk, religion, as a substitute. And maybe that would be, well, that's a reason why often people don't see the nuance between the nuance in the difference between confession and religion. So Armenian writers, like the Kurds that you mentioned, would probably consider it as just religion. But they mean confession, I think. But I'm not sure. I would need to think more about your comment.
I think we need to leave.
Okay.
Professor Aslanian, for today. Thank you.